Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. Please be seated. In 1873, in the middle of the sweltering summer heat of the lower Mississippi Valley, an epidemic of yellow fever descended on the city of Memphis, Tennessee. It started with a couple of cases, but within days the writing was on the wall. The disease was spreading fast. And following those initial news reports, thousands of Memphis residents fled, terrified of catching the sickness whose cause was still unknown. Of those who remained, 5,000 would go on to catch the fever, and almost 2,000 would die. But in the midst of the terror and flight out of the city, there were folks who remained to help. Among them were 5 Episcopal nuns, members of the Order of St. Mary, who would go on to be known as the Martyrs of Memphis. They had come to the city less than a year earlier to set up a school for girls in the former residence of the bishop. They'd envisioned this new calling of helping educate young women in a thriving city. Memphis was, at that time, the second largest city in the South. But those first cases of yellow fever would change the course of their calling and their lives. Despite their limited medical training, the sisters took charge of the care of more than 60 patients during the outbreak, giving them a space to recover and the attention that they needed to survive the fever, or comfort for those who would not. That experience would become essential when 5 years later, another round of yellow fever swept through the city of Memphis. This one more virulent and deadly than the last. More than half of the residents of the city fled for higher ground, leaving Memphis so sparsely populated that its charter as a city would be revoked. Thousands fell ill, thousands died. Within weeks, nearly all the doctors and trained nurses had fled the city, scared for their own lives. There were few trained medical professionals to be found anywhere. Even most of the clergy had fled with them. But the Sisters of St. Mary, led by their superior, Sister Constance, stayed behind. They went door to door throughout the city to locate the ill and provide what aid they could. They provided places of refuge and comfort. They gave out medicine and met people where they were. They took over one of the city's largest orphanages in order to care for its residents as the fever made its way through. They took the little training that they had and used it to impact the lives of the people around them, to offer love and care where there was so much fear and anxiety. They stayed in the city when nobody would have expected it of them. They had every reason to go, except for one, that this is what they knew, the ministry that they knew that God was calling them to, the ministry that God was calling them to live out, that all the plans they had made in advance of moving and creating their home in Memphis had gone out the window in order to meet the needs of the moment, in order to live out the love of God in these extraordinary times. The spread of the fever stopped with the first frost of 1878. By that time, more than 5,100 Memphis residents had died. Among them were 4 of the sisters and 2 priests who worked alongside them. They remained in Memphis until the end, bringing what comfort and aid they could to those who lacked the means to get out of the city. They provided comfort and aid and solidarity with those who needed it most. They offered a warm embrace and love when there was so much fear. They gave everything they had for the lives of those who they served, the lives of those who had been left behind. In our gospel reading today, Jesus is sitting with the disciples in the courtyard of the temple, watching people approach the treasury in order to give their offerings to God and to the temple. Jesus and the disciples see people coming up one by one, watching many rich people place in large sums into the chest of the treasury, giving from their abundant wealth. They're giving sums that would seem large to anyone looking on, that would seem impressive. And yet for the people leaving them, that amount of money would do little to inconvenience them in their daily lives. Maybe they gave out of some sense of dutiful obligation or merely a desire to be seen doing so. Or maybe they felt resentment for having to part with any of their money at all. And then, after these folks come up and leave their large sums, Jesus and the disciples watch a poor widow approach the treasury. Out of her hand drop 2 copper coins, worth as much as a penny, we are told. It is, we hear, all that she has. After the widow drops those coins into the chest, Jesus turns to his disciples and says, "Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all that she had to live on." What he points out is that her donation, all that she had, was a tremendous act of faith. It required her to trust completely that her faithfulness in giving would be met by God's faithfulness in protecting and supporting her. To put those 2 coins in required a leap of courageous faith. She chose to give all that she had, not in resentful obligation, but out of a confidence that God would provide for her, that God would sustain her. And it is that act of tremendous and courageous faith that Jesus praises. It would be easy to read the story as a parable about generosity, especially in the midst of stewardship season. Look at this widow who gave her last 2 pennies. If she can do that, surely you could increase your pledge by 10%. Or to say something about how every gift, no matter how small, matters, and so I need all of you to fill out one of the cards at the back of the church. Those things may be true and may be lessons you could draw from this. But I think this story is about so much more. The gospel contained within it is about way more than just generosity. The story is first and foremost about a woman's courageous faith and trust in God's faithfulness. It is about her willingness to give everything without expecting anything in return other than the knowledge that she followed God with her whole being, that she gave everything that she had to God. She was an ordinary woman, but had an extraordinary faith. And she showed more courage than the esteemed men around her, more courage and more faith than those who walked around with long robes, saying long prayers, hoping that they would be recognized and respected for their piety. And it is that fact, her faithfulness and what she did and her courage, that connects her story to that of the martyrs of Memphis, that of Constance and her companions. Like the widow in the story, they gave everything that they had to serve God and serve their community. They didn't go to Memphis to become martyrs. They went to be school teachers. But when they found themselves caught up in extraordinary circumstances, those ordinary women showed a courageous faith that led them to take actions above and beyond what would have been expected of them. When the trained professionals failed to live up to the moment and fled the city and the disease that swept across it, the Sisters of St. Mary gave everything. to care for the people around them who were suffering. Their courage was not about being seen or being praised, but about being faithful, faithful to who God called them to be. Despite the city around them falling apart, they remained faithful to following Christ and to serving the poor, the destitute, the sick, and the abandoned. We ourselves are living in extraordinary times. Our country is reeling from the experience and results of a deeply contested election, marked throughout the election process by vitriolic rhetoric and even politically motivated violence. And there is deep uncertainty over what the results of this election will mean for so many in our country, for our country as a whole, including and maybe especially immigrants, members of the LGBTQ plus community, and so many others who feel themselves at the margins. For more than half the country, the results of Tuesday's election is likely a welcome one. I think the votes show that. But for much of the rest of the country, there is a deep fear and anxiety over what is to come. I can't tell you what the next 4 years are going to be like. None of us can. But I can tell you, like I did last week, that whatever comes, our calling as followers of Christ remains the same that it has always been: to live our faith in our daily actions, as we seek to love our neighbors, to advocate for God's justice, and to uphold the dignity of every human being. Jesus calls his disciples to give themselves, to give everything to that work. And that sort of self-giving requires of us a courageous faith that does not retreat from the moment that we're living in, does not seek to tune it all out, and that does not let fear or anxiety dominate our lives. It requires a defiant faith that offers all that we have, and that is willing to reach across divisions to seek healing and wholeness. It requires a faith that prioritizes relationships and human beings over short-term economic gains for our own self-righteousness. This kind of faith is not a matter of disposition or belief, but is fundamentally about how we live our values in the world, how we treat our neighbors, and how we stand for what we know to be just and right and holy. When we give all that we have to that work, we can trust that God will be faithful to us, will sustain us, and will continue to bring about the loving transformation of our world, even when we can't see the signs of it. And this courageous faith is not something that we have to carry alone. Can't imagine that Constance and her companions would have done what they did had they been on their own. Instead, what gave them the strength and courage to continue on, to continue to minister to the people of Memphis, was knowing that they served together, that they were doing so as the body of Christ, and that God was with them every step of the way. Faith is something that we hold together. And in times like this, we need the community of believers around us more than ever. My hope for us is that we may, like the widow of our gospel and like Constance and her companions, live lives of courageous faith, confident that we do so through God's own faithfulness. May we give ourselves generously and wholly to the service of God and one another, building up one another in love, standing for God's love and justice, and for the dignity of every human being. May the faith that we have received, that courageous faith, anchor us in times of uncertainty and anxiety. And may God's church continue to be God's light in the world.